Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, Harley Schlanger. Harley is a historian, a national spokesman. He's been covering the financial industry since the 80s for LaRouche-Pac, that is LaRouchePac.com, and I am very happy to have him back on the X22 Report Spotlight. Harley, welcome back to the Spotlight.
Hi, Dave. It's always good talking with you.
Hey, thanks for being back, and there is a lot going on right now. And I wanted to start off with what's happening out in France, because all of a sudden we saw these yellow vests, start to protest, and people saying, well, they didn't want the climate tax and that's why they're really out there. But then it morphed into something much, much larger than that, and other countries started to join in. I mean, do you think Macron is going to bow to the people and actually work with them and listen to them? Or do you think he's just out there and he's going to continue to do the same thing he's always been doing?
No, he's a snake oil salesman, and he works for the leading bankers of Brussels and the City of London. He's going to keep doing what he's doing. But the problem is that, as you point out, it's not just France. As I've been reporting for many, many months, actually since the time of the Brexit and the U.S. election, there's a global insurgency underway. And it's an insurgency against those people like Macron, or like the Clintons and the Obamas in the United States, the people who think they can lie, they can treat the population with arrogant disregard. There's no more tolerance for that. And what we see with the Yellow Vest movement is a breakout in France. Now, I don't know if people in the United States know this, but the origin of Yellow Vests is that in most European countries, if you have a car break down on the side of the road, you're supposed to put on a yellow vest, which signals that you need help. And so you had, starting in the rural and agricultural sector of France, a reaction against Macron's climate tax. Now, it shows you how arrogant Macron is. He actually believes that he can impose these kinds of taxes to support fraudulent science, the anti-carbon movement, as a way of reducing allegedly pollution. But what it really does is reduce living standards. And people would have none of that. And as they started marching, they realized that it was this way in every aspect of French life, the economy, the complete disregard for the loss of people's livelihood. There was one really interesting statement made by someone in Paris who was marching. And they said, aren't you concerned about the climate and what's happening with global warming? And he said, every day they tell us that the world is coming to an end, and we can't make it to the end of the week. And I think that really identifies the mentality. The second point that identifies what's going on is that the police sided with the demonstrators. And then you had the typical operation of sending in the Antifa, the Black Bloc, the anarchists to try and tear up the Champs-Élysées and throw rocks at police. And the police arrested them, but continued supporting the demonstration. The firefighters supported it. And the French military, a letter was sent out by retired military officials supporting the people. And the polls show 80% of the population in France is against Macron. So typically, the chameleon Macron came out and said, okay, we'll change this for 6 months. And that's not going to stop it. They're still continuing to march. They're continuing to organize. There may be a vote of no confidence brought up in the French parliament against Macron. I don't know if they can win that, but I think what this movement has done is make it clear to the Brussels bureaucrats, in conjunction with the continued fight around Brexit in the United Kingdom, the whole situation developing in Italy, that the people of Europe are not going to tolerate this kind of bureaucratic control anymore.
Yeah, I mean, do you think if Macron comes out and he says, okay, listen, we're going to listen to you, we're going to work with you, do you think the people are going to go along with him? Because what is the end goal of the people that are protesting?
Well, it started as the end goal was to repeal the taxes. But right. They realized it's much more than taxes.
I mean, do they want Macron gone?
Well, I think that's becoming a more general sentiment now, because here's this so-called smooth guy who's seemingly was riding above the waves of protests in Europe. And now he's shown himself to be just another one of these bureaucrats. And I think one of the things about France is that the French people are not pretentious. We have this view of the French as snobs, but the average Frenchman doesn't want to be treated arrogantly any more than the average American. And when they demonstrate, they have this one tradition in rural France called the honey wagon, where they load up their carts with cow manure and dump it in the city hall. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that coming from France. I don't think Macron can be trusted. And what he says about holding this back, he made this big deal that he's going to increase the minimum wage and he's going to increase overtime pay. And then every one of those promises had a caveat to it, which means he's not going to do it. So I don't think he's going to get away with it.
Yeah, that's what normally happens is they make promises and they always have a back door so they don't have to follow through on their promise. I mean, we also see out in the UK, I mean, May has already said that she most likely will not run in the next election. We know Merkel and many other leaders are looking not to continue on. I mean, is this just a huge movement where these actors, these players of all these governments of part of the establishment, they're saying, something, our time's up. Maybe we should step down now?
I think it's bigger than the leaders. What we're seeing is a breakdown of the system, the complete breakdown. And you see it in terms of the recognition by someone like Janet Yellen, the former Federal Reserve chairman, who 2 years ago said there'll be no new financial crisis in our lifetime. And then last week she said, help, there are gaping holes in the system. They're seeing their system break down. And they don't have answers. Their answers are stay the course, keep the power in the hands of the Anglo-American elites, the bankers, protect the banking system, protect the financial speculators. And it's just not going to work. And they're not that clever. I mean, this is something that I think you and I have talked about before. These elites are not so smart. They've painted themselves into a corner. And what they can do is try to divert attention, as they do with Russiagate, as they're doing with the demonization of Putin, the demonization of China. But I think it's not going to work because you can say Putin did this. They said Putin was behind the yellow vests at one point.
Right.
Well, I really don't think the Russians are handing out vodka to French peasants. Or that the French peasants were reacting based on Twitter feeds from the GRU. At a certain point, it's so absurd to say to people that their motivation is that the Russians posted ads on Facebook. And when people who were involved in these mobilizations hear that, it just makes them more angry. Now, I think the key thing is to go beyond anger to real thinking. We've got to identify what is the cause of this crisis, the systemic crisis, who's behind it, how they're trying to manipulate us, running psyops against the American people, and then take them down and do it in ways that are perfectly legal. And for example, the declassification of the documents related to Russiagate. That's something that will probably finish the careers of a large number of Washington insiders in the intelligence community, the Justice Department, and so on. So these things have to be done. And I don't think promises from people like Macron or Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden will carry much water.
Now, you mentioned the declassification, and I think it was Judge Sullivan who ordered Mueller to provide the 302s for Flynn. And it seems that Mueller was hemming and hawing, but really didn't give the 302s from January. He gave the judge the ones that, they created months later. And is Mueller right now, is he backed into a corner? Because if he does present the real 302s, it's going to show that Flynn wasn't lying.
Well, Judge Sullivan is an interesting case because he demanded all relevant exculpatory documents in the Flynn case. And Mueller produced two documents. One was the original write-up from the now departed FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, setting up the Flynn interrogation. And the other one, as you mentioned, was the 302 that was prepared in August, 7 months later. The FBI policy is the 302s have to be submitted within 5 days of the interrogation. Now, the one that was submitted within 5 days of the interrogation, we haven't seen yet. Mueller didn't produce it. Maybe they destroyed it along with thousands of text messages between Lisa Page and Peter Strzok. I think Sullivan is getting at something that's important. I mean, there are a few things that it should be said on Flynn, but the first is that his discussion with the Russian ambassador, which is at the heart of the question, was totally legal. And what they got him on was they tricked him into having a discussion without an attorney. They told him he doesn't need an attorney. They didn't tell him this was an on-the-record interrogation. And they were operating from a transcript of a tapped phone conversation that he had with Kislyak. Now, then this included the fact that Flynn was unmasked, that is, he was identified by either Samantha Power or Susan Rice, two Obama officials. And then this was leaked to David Ignatius of the Washington Post. So they created a whole environment around Flynn at the point that Mueller was coming at him with a bulldozer, forcing him to sell his house to pay for his legal costs, threatening to put his son in prison, to bankrupt him. And Flynn folded. He basically said, okay, I'll take a plea for lying. Now, if this comes out in the context of all the other corrupt practices routinely used by prosecutors, but taken to perfection by Mueller, he's in big trouble. And tomorrow, or I should say the December 18th, we'll know whether Sullivan follows through. I mean, he could hold Mueller in contempt. He could overturn the case. I don't know if he'll do that. But remember, he was the judge who overturned the conviction of Senator Ted Stevens based on government and FBI misconduct in preparing the case. So we'll see. But it does show that if you lift the cover of the Mueller investigation, there's nothing there except fraud.
Now, if he does, get the real information and he sees what Mueller has been doing, couldn't he say, this is completely, what's the word I'm looking for, illegal, or, it's a crime that you committed?
Government misconduct. That's what he ruled in, yeah.
Government misconduct. Wouldn't Whitaker then say, okay, this is ridiculous. Look what he did in this case. Maybe we should open up everything Mueller has been doing and look into what he's been doing, because if he did it to this one person, we should look at all the others and see what he's been doing this whole entire time, and maybe we need to get rid of him.
Well, I think that's obviously the case. We shouldn't get ahead of ourselves in the Sullivan ruling, but and his ruling will be on the Flynn case. But it could be that he will accurately portray the Mueller operation against Flynn as misconduct, as government abuse of power. And if that's done, then you look at the Papadopoulos case. Then you start opening up the question of the setup by the FBI and British intelligence, that they were the ones who planted the whole story of Russian hacking of the DNC documents and so on. They're spending all this time trying to implicate Roger Stone and having some connection with WikiLeaks, when the whole story was coming from British intelligence operatives. Christopher Steele was involved, Stefan Halper, Mifsud, Alexander Downer. There's a whole crew of these people who are identifiable with ties to both British intelligence and the CIA and the FBI. So the individual case of Flynn is important because you have to look at why Flynn was targeted. And that has a lot to do with the fact that Flynn agreed completely with Trump as a competent military man that we should not be going to war with Russia in Syria. And secondly, we should go to war on the side with Russia against the terrorists that the Obama administration was supporting. That's why Flynn was fired from his position at the Defense Intelligence Agency, and that's why there was such a targeting of him related to his appointment as National Security Director for Trump. They didn't want him in there because of what he knew. And so they tried to take him out and destroy him. Now, that's the story that then opens the whole door on every bit of the corruption involved in the Mueller investigation.
Let's move on to the Clinton Foundation, because we had this independent firm that was investigating the Clinton Foundation, and they're out there saying this acted more like a foreign entity than anything else. I mean, why do you think all of a sudden this is coming out, and why is this being brought into the spotlight?
There have been people trying to bring it out for a long time. I mean, this has been a focus of some of President Trump's collaborators. I know Roger Stone has been focused on this for a while. And what they're basically saying, which is true, is if you want to look for collusion and meddling in U.S. elections, there are many places you can start besides Vladimir Putin, including some of the networks in Israel, some of the networks in Saudi Arabia, some of the Middle Eastern countries, which gave huge amounts of money to the Clinton Foundation. So, there's a lot to be investigated there. But, I would put one word of caution on it, which is that I think at a certain point, this can be a diversion away from really going at the whole Mueller case. I mean, it's fine to say, look, they let Hillary get away with all these things that they're accusing Trump of doing. But more importantly, let's get at the people who are accusing Trump. What are they covering up? What is their policy? What do they want to do? Why do they want to get rid of Trump? And I think if you do that and defend and protect the president so that he can proceed with his strategic policies, then you create the circumstances where we're not going to end up in war. We're not going to end up in crazy proxy wars around the world. And then you can take on over time the question of what the Clintons were doing, what Obama was doing. But we've got to defend the presidency first. And I think people like Mark Meadows, who have done a very good job of bringing up the British role in Russiagate, the Christopher Steele connection, and so on, should stick with that till we fully discredit the whole narrative against Trump, because if there's just not enough capability to fight this on 6 different flanks, and we have a totally exposed flank, this British intelligence, CIA, FBI, Justice Department, Peter Strzok, McCabe. Some of these names are now very familiar. And by the way, Dave, as you know, some of them also were involved in exonerating Hillary Clinton at the same time they were going after Trump.
Right.
So I'm not saying forget the Clinton investigation. I'm saying let's win the fight on Russiagate, which will give us the high ground to take on these other battles.
Well, I mean, one way to do this is to declass the FISA, because one thing would lead to another, and you would expose the entire gang that they're all colluding together. I mean, that's what everyone is really waiting for. And I know timing is very, very important. I understand they're trying to get all this information out there and expose these people, because Trump has been tweeting like crazy about the Clintons, about Mueller, about, all these individuals. But there's going to be a point in time where they're going to have to declassify and show everyone what these people have done, what the Obama administration has done, what the Clintons have done, what they did when they spied on him, how they created the fake dossier. Because once that comes out and the truth comes out, it will knock down the mainstream media. It will shut up all these people who are saying this is, a conspiracy theory. It would bring down the whole house.
I think that time is now, and I agree with you completely that getting this out, there's nothing more important than putting in the hands of the American people the evidence which shows that there was an effort made at the highest levels of the Obama administration, coordinated with the Clintons, directed by British intelligence, to keep Donald Trump out of the White House. That's what Peter Strzok's text messages to his girlfriend, Lisa Page, were about. We need an insurance policy in case Trump wins. So they were trying to knock Trump out, because this goes back to June and July 2016, when they came up with this crossfire hurricane when they started targeting the Trump officials, the illegal wiretapping, using the Steele dossier, and so on. Now, once you start piecing that together, what you can show is that this also goes back to the whole phony war on terror, the whole Bush operation, which really pushed FISA into the forefront. The targeting by the National Security Agency of everybody's emails and phone conversations, the establishment of a security state in the United States. And this is what Trump is fighting. You know, he's not just fighting to save his office. He came in with an intention, and his intention was to break the back of the Bush-Obama-Clinton security policy, which was based on wars, based on regime change, based on protecting these swindlers and speculators of the global banks. And Trump came in with an intention of reversing that, of breaking out of that paradigm. And that's why they turned against him. And I think if we can get that story out in as clear a way as possible, it will create the basis for not just stopping this operation, but putting the real criminals behind bars, like John Brennan and Clapper and Comey. Comey is bragging about the fact that he knew that the investigation of Flynn was a fraud. Peter Strzok is such a strange character that it's funny, but he's the one he and another person, another FBI agent, did the interrogation of Flynn. And they both said they didn't think Flynn was lying. Now, the FBI won't allow the other person, whose name I don't have in front of me right now, they won't allow him to be questioned because he admits that the whole thing was a setup. So this has to get out. And I don't think the president is being served well by people who say, hold your cards, play this later on in the game. Let's put it out on the table right now.
I mean, are they afraid of the people accepting this information? Do you think they're afraid of people hearing this and rejecting what the president and what they're putting out there?
I don't think so. I mean, they shouldn't be. If you engage people in a conversation in a lunchroom or a bar or something about this, you start having people bring up 9/11, bring up the lies about the Kennedy assassination. Most of the American people know they've been lied to for many, many years. It's not something new. But now the media is trying to say, well, Trump is the big liar. And it has an effect. I think that's why you reach a saturation point where the psychological warfare can win, where people finally say, I don't care anymore. I don't think any side is any good. And while you still have the potential, the power, the president still has the power to move on these things, including breaking out of the stranglehold of some of the people in his own administration. He has to do it. And so postponing this doesn't do him any good.
No, I think it's almost time that this all needs to come out, and the people need to see the truth, because one thing will lead into another, and then it's just a whole avalanche after that. And
well, Dave, let me just give you an example of a story that has to get out. Have you been hearing about this integrity initiative from the British government?
No, explain.
It's a very interesting story that's just starting to break. The British government, 90% of this so-called NGO is funded by the Foreign Ministry of Britain. And its purpose is to set up teams in every British consulate in the world to find ways to attack Russia. And this integrity initiative works through what they call shaping public opinion through organizing clusters who accept their propaganda. This is what we saw with the Skripal affair, where all over the world you had these clusters coming out saying, of course the Russians poisoned him. This is typical of Putin, and so on. Now, what's interesting is that these are the people who, in the last couple of weeks, started intervening in British internal politics by attacking Jeremy Corbyn, the head of the Labour Party. And so now there's a big public scandal, because this means the British Foreign Ministry has paid agents intervening in British internal politics. And that's suddenly broken out in the Daily Mail and other press. It's not so different from finding the Obama administration running an operation against Trump. But we're now seeing the mother of this coming from directly financed by the British government. And so this story is, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche keeps saying, this is so much bigger than Watergate. And if the American people ever understand what's being done to them, that it's not just being done to Trump, the target is the American people. When Hillary called people Trump supporters, a basket of deplorables, that's their view. And I'll go one step further. Their economic policy is designed to reduce the population of the deplorables. That's why there's a rebellion, because people sense that this climate change nonsense, the economic policy, the bailout of the banks, but the shutdown of industry, you look at General Motors, the layoffs there, they're destroying what's left of the middle class in the United States. And I mean destroying it. There's a reduction of life expectancy now among American males. This is not conspiracy theory. This is coming from medical journals, from the CDC. You add up the opioid epidemic, the suicides, alcoholism, the poor treatment of veterans, and you see they're driving people to death. And this is not a coincidence. This is their policy. And that's why you have a potential to rally people, but you lose that potential as the propaganda numbs people. And that's why I think you have to get it out right now, the declassified documents.
Yeah, I just want to go back for a second. So what is their main goal of reducing the population and doing what they're doing? Like, why are they doing this?
Well, at the top of the establishment, if you look at the early funding of the so-called environmentalist movement, it was funded by the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, by the real oligarchs who believe that they need a servant class, but that servant class has to be kept in place. It shouldn't be too large. It shouldn't be too well-fed. It shouldn't be too self-confident. This is an old imperial policy. But what we've seen going back to the 60s, when the zero growth movement was launched, zero population growth, Meadows and Forrester, the Club of Rome, they started saying that we have to reduce the world's population. There are too many people. And basically they're saying there aren't enough resources. And if the whole population undergoes an explosion of economic development and becomes middle class, it will take away from the possessions of the wealthiest, the power of the wealthiest. So they've always opposed any movement which gives strength to a growing middle class. This is why they're opposed to sovereignty, because they don't want people in any nation to have a sense of their own power to run their own government for their interests, as opposed to the private interests of the leading bankers. And so there's a character in Germany who's on the Pontifical Academy. He's a member of the British Empire, knighted by the Queen, and he's the chief science advisor to Merkel, a guy named Schellenhuber, who's written that there should be only 500 million to 1 billion people on the planet. And they're serious about this. This is what this nutcase new congressman from New York is talking about with her Green New Deal, is destroying science, destroying technology. What's the result of that? You're not going to have a cleaner planet. You're going to have a lot more dead bodies. So this has been the long-term goal of these elites. And if you want to put it in the realm of religion, these are actually satanic people. They're evil. They don't like human beings. And so I think their economic policies, their social policies, their war policies fit in perfectly to explain that this is in fact what their agenda is, to keep control by preventing populations from experiencing their own capabilities for self-government. That's why the British Empire has always hated the American Revolution.
So do you think they're nervous right now because the movement that is going on. I mean, it started with Trump and then it started to, go across into Europe and many other countries. Are they nervous about this movement that everything that they planned on is not going the way they thought?
They're more than nervous. They're hysterical. They're desperate. You look at someone like Brennan. Trump meets with Putin. They have a discussion of reducing arms. This is the same discussion Reagan was having with Gorbachev, which was supported by the American people. And so Trump and Putin are talking about how we can cut back nuclear weapons so we don't have to, as Trump said, it's insane to spend $800 billion a year on defense. And so what does Brennan do? He says this is treason. The media doesn't even cover the discussion that went on between Trump and Putin on arms control and taking up the intermediate nuclear force agreement and things of that sort. They take up Trump is kissing Putin's ring. So I would say they're hysterical. Look, they're also paranoid because they can't control the financial crisis. In 2008, when things blew, they controlled it. They used quantitative easing, free money policy to bail out the banks, to bail out the derivatives markets, to bail out the speculators. But in the process, they created an even bigger debt. Today, public and private indebtedness is 60% larger than it was in 2008. That's why Yellen is talking about corporate debt. That's why we're seeing the Bank for International Settlements and the IMF suddenly warning that the debt problem, corporate debt, private sector debt, credit card debt, is unsustainable. Now, that could be a trigger to blow out the whole financial system. And what they're especially worried about is that in the background, you can see China forging ahead with its Belt and Road Initiative. You can see other countries talking about baskets of currencies besides the dollar system or the petrodollar system. You see discussions about major investment, not sticking to the rules of austerity, but actually investing in physical production that will increase the benefits for the populations on mutual benefits. And so they can see enough to know that their end is coming. And so they're going to fight like hell to prevent it. And what we have to do is we have to prepare the people who like what Trump did in his election, who like what the French demonstrators are doing, who are excited about the Italian situation and the Austrian situation fighting against the EU, educate them to understand there's a solution behind this, which is called the American economic system, investment in physical economy, which means you take the power of generating credit away from private banks, away from the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank and so on, and put it into elected officials who operate through the Treasury to directly inject credit into the system for physical production, not for speculation. And if that happens, that's the end of the banksters.
I mean, Trump is out there and he's continually contradicting the Fed, about the rates and things like that.
Yeah.
If the economy blows up, he's actually pointing the finger saying, you're responsible for this.
No, I think this is important. I think that we saw that with Trump on the campaign when he was talking about Glass-Steagall regulation, when
Right.
he was talking about not liking hedge funds, that he's a builder, not a speculator. I think there are a lot of signs, but this is something that he's got to fight out in the Republican Party as well, because you have the Republican Party is a Wall Street party, and so is the Democratic Party. You have people in each party who could move, but this is where he's got to organize the population the way he did in the 2018 Senate races that he intervened in. He's got to directly put himself out there to educate people to understand why he's attacking the Fed. And, I think because of the work over the years by Ron Paul and work that LaRouche did, people are very skeptical about the Federal Reserve. They're skeptical about the bailout policies after 2008, but they don't know enough about it. And I think we have to keep a discussion process of this going so that people can grasp it.
In the past, when we had economic collapse or a big change, there was always like some type of an event, a war or something. So the central banks would be able to cover everything up. This time, I think they're kind of stuck because they didn't get their war. So if Trump is out there continually contradicting them, pointing the finger at the Fed, and the economy does come down, because he's going to say, look, my numbers are great. Unemployment very low. GDP looks fantastic. Look at this. I made a great economy. Look what you did. You raised the rates and you brought the entire system down. To me, and this is what I'm thinking, he's trying to pivot and make the blame all on the Fed to eventually maybe audit the Fed, open up their books, show the world what they did, and maybe take them over, get rid of them. I don't know.
Well, that's what he should do. And I think that you're right in he's not just jawboning Jerome Powell to keep the interest rates a little lower. This is why they hate Trump, because they don't control him. Now, he doesn't always do what's right. I think there are some aspects of, I think the idea of punitive tariffs against China isn't going to get manufacturing back in the United States, but it is getting a deal with China. His attacks on Kim Jong-un, where they said, he's going to get us into a war. Then he has a peace meeting. He actually moves things forward, and the Democrats are saying he's capitulating to the dictator. So they're never going to give him credit. And he doesn't need credit. He needs to keep moving, keep doing things, stay ahead of them, and tell people, this is why I'm doing it. I point to the difference between one aspect of what happened with John F. Kennedy and Trump. Kennedy knew they were gunning for him because of his moves on Vietnam, his efforts to get a back channel relationship with the Russians, and then in particular his move to extend Treasury credit as opposed to Federal Reserve notes to try and deal with the steel crisis and get the economy going. He was moving in that direction, but he didn't tell people. And he didn't publicly identify the CIA networks and the others that were out to get him, the J. Edgar Hoover networks. What Trump is doing is revolutionary. He's going out there saying, these guys are corrupt. These guys are running a witch hunt. His attacks on Mueller, this has to be burning a hole in their gut, because presidents aren't supposed to publicly attack their intelligence agencies. So he's doing a lot. And the fact that he isn't doing everything everybody wants, so what? Get on board this fight and make sure we win the fight and defeat the deep state. If we can do that, then, as you're saying, it opens the whole question of the Federal Reserve, of a national credit policy, of actually lowering defense spending, putting money instead into infrastructure, into improving the roads and transportation systems in the U.S., the education system, which is in terrible shape. There's so many things we could do if we weren't in a neo-Cold War arms buildup, and at the same time, a defensive protection of bankrupt financial institutions. Those are the two problems we face, and they're created by an elite which has lost its mind, if it ever had a mind. And so let's get rid of them and bring the American people fully onto the stage of history.
I agree.
That's what I think Trump means by national sovereignty. Let the people set the policy agenda for the national governments, for the interests of the people.
I agree. Harley, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people see your work?
Well, as you know, I'm always happy to communicate with your viewers. And if you send me an email to my personal email at harleysch@gmail.com, I'll get you a link to my blog. I put out at least one article a week. So it's harleysch@gmail.com. And then go to larouchepac.com. LAROUCHEPAC.com to see daily news stories and videos.
Harley, great. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate you coming on the X22 Report Spotlight. Thank you very much.
Okay, good talking with you, Dave.
You too.